So, kia ora koutou, ko Victoria McLennan, tako ingoa, and welcome to this IT Professionals Fireside Chat that I have today with Paul Ash, who's here to talk to us about the Christchurch Call. Welcome, Paul.
Kia ora tātou katoa. Thank you, Vic. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today.
Yeah, it's awesome, and it's a really hot kind of topic at the moment. There's big platforms, what they're doing, and regulation, and there's lots going on globally. So I'm looking forward to getting into some questions with you. But first, I thought you could introduce yourself to our audience.
Ka pai. Thanks, Vic. Kia ora tātou katoa. I'm Paul Ash. I am the Chief Executive here at the Christchurch Call Foundation, which is a small foundation established just on a year ago to support the work of the Christchurch Call. How did I get to this job? How did I end up here? That's quite an interesting journey. I've done a range of things over the course of a career. I spent 21 years in the Foreign Ministry as a New Zealand diplomat, so working in Taiwan, mainland China, Solomon Islands, Brussels. Over the course of that career, a lot of trade work, a lot of security policy work, but also actually an interest in digital issues that really grew. I first connected to the internet in Beijing in 1996, navigated my way through a Chinese language set of instructions to understand how to do that because I was a bit bloody minded and didn't want to pay up for the software that the Beijing Telegraph Administration suggested I needed because I had this amazing new laptop with Windows 95 and not laptop, desktop and trumpet windsock, which would of course mean I didn't need all that stuff. Little did I know that a Chinese language brochure with all of the HTTP and DNS requirements was something I had to learn as well, a new language. And it's continued through there. I lived in Taiwan through the .com crash and saw the impacts of that on probably the most active economy in the world when it came to tech work at the time. Made my way through some time in the Pacific and understanding what some of the digital divide looked like if you were in a post-conflict zone in the Pacific. And then Brussels, where I learned an awful lot about the regulatory impact and normative impact of the Brussels effect. From there, I came back to New Zealand in 2012, and that's when I met, I guess, a number of members of ITP and Internet NZ and other organisations as I picked up the work leading the National Cyber Policy Office. I kept at that for about 5 years and then moved over to head up national security policy, which I was working on when the Christchurch attacks happened. Big focus there, though, was on digital issues and on cyber issues. And after standing up the Christchurch Call in 2019, was supporting Jacinda Ardern and Emmanuel Macron to drive that work, was appointed the Prime Minister's Special Representative on Cyber and Digital, and that meant a really wide range of digital issues that I ended up engaging with over that time. And I left government just under a year ago. 1st of July this year was, last year, sorry, was my first day as not being a public servant after 35 years.
Wow.
I'm adapting and flourishing, I think, and really enjoying the different environment. It means I can finally join Internet NZ and ITP and a few other organisations where I'd have been conflicted previously. And that's a really interesting part of the journey now.
Great, and it's fantastic to have you here. Thank you. So just before we kick off with some questions that I want to ask you, give us your elevator pitch for how you describe what the Christchurch Call is when you meet someone new.
I think most people know what happened in 2019 with the live stream of the Christchurch attacks. It was unprecedented. It was of a scale that we'd not seen before. The algorithmic amplification that kicked in and the way that trust and safety measures were able to be circumvented was also unprecedented. It quickly became apparent that governments couldn't solve for that problem on their own. Tech firms weren't able to do it on their own, and nor were all the civil society and academic groups working on this. It struck those of us trying to work out how to respond to that we actually needed something that went back to the roots of multi-stakeholder internet governance, and that fundamentally dealing with harmful content online was an internet governance issue, and one that we needed to work in that multi-stakeholder fashion. Fast forward 6 years, there's been a lot of progress, but there's actually still an awful lot to be done in the Christchurch Call commitments. And it's that multi-stakeholder approach that brings together the best that governments, industry, civil society, and academia, really classic parts of the internet governance community, can bring to bear on that problem.
So I guess it's a good segue into my first question, which is, what are some of the biggest challenges you've had to overcome with the program since its inception?
Yeah, it's a great question. I might start by just talking a little bit about what we've actually done in the time since.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So,
Thank you.
the Christchurch attacks happened on the 15th of March 2019. By 15 May 2019, 8 weeks later, we had developed 25 commitments for governments, tech firms, and civil society and academia to work together on. And those commitments were really wide-ranging. They went from the proximate symptoms of the problem. So how do we deal with live streaming? How do we think about upload of terrorist and violent extremist content? How do we think about media freedoms and freedom of expression in the midst of all of that, and protecting human rights? Because the simplest solutions could actually be quite harmful if they were implemented. How do we think about the role of regulation and the role of civil society and academia and contributing to that and making sure that community perspectives were heard? And how did we get a layer beyond those proximate issues to the drivers of terrorist and violent extremist activity online, many of which are actually offline drivers? They go to social conditions and systems, they go to ideologies, and then they can be amplified online. So the 25 commitments encapsulated that, and a reasonably frenetic 8-week period of negotiating those led to the launch in 15 May 2019. With good, strong support from industries, from governments, 17 governments when we started, 8 different tech platforms. We quickly realised there was in the core community that there was first a need to build a community, and second a need to find a way of delivering on those commitments. No point just issuing a call and saying job done. That was a moment in time. So the key there was really around rolling people's sleeves up and getting down to the process of what kind of constructs would enable us to deliver those commitments, and how do we work on some of the immediate things like crisis response mechanisms. The period from 15 May 2019 to the end of that year was really a blur, actually, if I think back, of working practically across tech firms, governments, and civil society on exactly those problems, putting in place a crisis response protocol, growing the size of the community. So we added another 31 governments by September and a bunch more tech firms, establishing a Christchurch Call advisory network so that we could work with civil society groups and others, and then standing up some working groups and projects. As we worked that through, we got hit by COVID at the end of the year, and had to try and do most of that virtually. Everyone went through that. But it was at a pretty pivotal moment for a nascent community trying to work on this issue. By the time we navigated some of those issues, we came out of it in quite a resilient fashion. We were able to build a lot of online working groups and make sure that the work continued through that period. We had another summit in 2021 that was fully digital, with I think about 16 different world leaders in it, tech platform leaders, and managed to do that, drawing on the work the Foreign Ministry had done to take APEC fully digital that year as well. Repurposed the same platform, reskinned the studios, and ran Christchurch Call Summit out of that construct. That, I guess, period to the question of challenges was one where maintaining and sustaining the focus and momentum was really challenging, not least because actually the problems that we were grappling with around radicalisation to violent extremism were made worse by the COVID pandemic, and some of the issues around the use of technology to try and radicalise to violence in particular. And that got us to the point where in 2022, when we started travelling again, the rest of the world had been travelling for a while, but we were able to hold a new summit that then pulled together leaders to look at some new issues. The big challenge we'd had through that period was getting beyond crisis response to understanding some of the issues around algorithmic amplification and the way user journeys might take them from innocuous or benign content through to harmful content, through to radicalisation to violence, and looking at how a multi-stakeholder community could design interventions. We got some good announcements in 2022 about the initiative on algorithmic outcomes and some of the use of privacy-enhancing technologies to make that possible. A lot of work was carried out on that through 22-23. We then had another summit in November 2023, at which point it was evident we needed a different structure for supporting the core work. The New Zealand government remained supportive, but the scope of the work had grown beyond the ability of the Treasury to cover that off. It also it became apparent that any one government being the place that all of that work was vested was, I guess, a recipe for instability, political change, or other changes could cut across. So in 2023, there was a decision to build a more resilient secretariat structure. We've been working on that for quite a while. And in particular, in doing that, to honour the legacy of the work the core had done, really, that it was of sufficient gravity and weight that it shouldn't just be able to be turned around at the whim of a funding decision or a similar problem. So the 23 summit agreed to work on that. It happened a month after the outbreak of conflict in Gaza, and that has had a huge impact on the field of terrorist and violent extremist content, both in terms of sustaining sufficient goodwill for communities to work together, and in the content that has emerged as a consequence of the Gaza conflict. We needed new tools for that. Fast forward to today, we now have that structure. That's been a major part of our work program, is standing up the team we have and sustaining support. That's been done largely through philanthropic trusts that have supported us, with a small amount of government funding from some governments coming our way as well, but being able to nurture and continue key things like crisis response, like the initiative on algorithmic outcomes, while building a new secretariat has been a significant challenge as well. And I'd say, just to come back to your earlier question about the biggest challenges, I think at this distance from the events of 2019, sustaining a focus on why we started the work and continuing to keep a multi-stakeholder collaboration running is probably the biggest challenge we have ahead of us. We're in an environment where multi-stakeholderism is under huge threat globally, where certainly the tech sector is operating quite differently than it did up to the end of last year, where some unintended consequences of things like regulation are kicking in, where it's actually very hard to sustain collaborative models in a regulatory environment. And some of the pushback on that regulation is proving very challenging. So that, in terms of challenges, I would say those are the major things we've navigated.
And in a world where there's so much change, isn't there, and geopolitics have so much influence, and that's just that backdrop for you must be quite challenging, I imagine. Yeah,
it is. I mean, I think personally having a background in diplomacy is very, very helpful at the moment. And if I look, say, at the trustees of the foundation, we've very, very carefully ensured that we have trustees who aren't active in the hurly-burly, the day-to-day of that work, but have deep experience in it. So we have a trustee with a strong, strong background in human rights and business. We have a trustee from the Christchurch community with a strong background in quite how the events of Christchurch have impacted that community. One with a strong background in government, but no longer working in government, in policy. And one from industry, having retired from being Vice President of Trust and Safety at a major tech platform. We will augment that number over time, but we've been quite deliberate about getting that range of different capabilities.
Nice. Now, for everyone who's listening to this or watching it live, you can ask Paul questions via the Q&A function. So, and I will relay them for you. Now, back to my questions. I know there are many misconceptions out there too, either from critics or folks who work in the tech industry. What have you found yourself having to explain the most often about the Christchurch Call?
So great question, because we have to do quite a lot of explaining for different constituencies.
I can imagine.
Just
Yeah.
a quick question, Vic. I have frozen on my screen. I want to make sure I haven't on yours.
You have frozen on my screen. That's a very good point. I was so busy looking at the Q&A, I was ignoring you. Oh,
And I
wonder
think
what's happened.
that Zoom is, you can hear me okay,
Zoom doesn't
right?
love it. Yeah, I can hear you fine. You could try turning your video off and back on. There's a wee video button down the bottom there. You can press stop video and maybe turn it back on, see if it comes back.
Yeah, I'm getting all sorts of Zoom is crashing messages on my screen, which is entirely
No.
unhelpful at this point.
Well, a few people are saying they can still hear you, so will we
Right.
just carry on then?
Why don't we just keep going and we'll see if we can.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm not
if
even getting
Zoom
an
comes
option
back
to,
to life.
not even getting an option to turn my camera off. I'm just getting a spinning blue circle at the moment.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
That's right. I'm sure there's someone in ITP who could help fix the coding on that. We could go and have a chat to Zoom. They're a Christchurch Call supporter and have been really helpful as we've carried out the work. In terms of misconceptions, where to start? I guess the first one is that we're not here to censor the internet, right? That our job is not to look across the internet, look for the content wherever we find it and censor it. We don't have that capability, and it's really probably counter to our purpose. What we are trying to do is eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content while protecting human rights and a free, open and secure internet. I guess a subset of that is that we're really focused on terrorist and violent extremist content and the drivers of it. So there are some immediate things we can do that help prevent the likelihood of live streaming of terrorist attacks. There have been, last I looked, just on 400 attempts, I think, to repeat the Christchurch attack by
Wow.
people or emulate it.
Wow.
And none of them has had the impact that Christchurch did. That Christchurch had that impact is one of the reasons, though, that there are so many others attempting to do so. So there's an iterative process here for us working with governments and firms to try and keep people safe from that kind of content. And we are very focused on both those measures, but then as the call work continues, trying to get upstream of that, what causes someone to be radicalized to violent extremism and terrorism online? What in the online environment exacerbates what's happening in their offline lives? And how can we think about safe ways to disrupt that across civil society, industry and government that protect human rights and a free, open and secure internet? I mentioned earlier some of the easiest solutions are probably some of the most damaging. There are places where terrorist and violent extremist content has been largely eliminated, but using methods that none of us would find acceptable because the internet is censored, and that's not where we want to go. I guess the other regular criticism is that we either haven't held the tech sector to account or that big tech operates untrammeled. And I guess some of that also reflects a great degree of frustration with the way the tech sector operates, absolutely. But it also, I think, slightly misses the nature of the multi-stakeholder environment we're trying to work in. That is that we have set out some commitments that are there to be met. We will set out on a journey to try and work on those together, and there will be setbacks along the way. We've seen them in governments, we've seen them in the tech sector, we've probably seen some in civil society as well. And we do have to find a way to try and navigate our way through that, given how volatile.
Oh, we've lost some. Let's hope that Paul magically can rejoin. Sorry, everyone. This is a bit of a worry. There's a lovely, helpful comment on here about Zoom has started reducing old app support to push for people to update. Happened to this person who's anonymous yesterday, and they've upgraded to and they've upgraded to a 64-bit version. So I'm hoping we'll be able to restart a Zoom, and you will all be patient enough to stick with us for a little while we get them back. Apologies, everyone. And I hope that you're all having lovely days and are staying warm, because, man, it's cold out there. Well, it is here in Wellington anyway. No, Kim, I couldn't tell any jokes because I don't know any. But if anyone has any jokes, please feel free to put them in the Q&A while we wait for Paul to come back, because I am terrible. Looks like he's nearly here, which is good. We've got a box, so we're nearly there. Paul, can you hear me? No, maybe
I've
not
left and joined
quite.
again.
Yep, awesome. We can hear you. We've got a blank screen. We can't see you, but I can hear you. You can hear me okay?
Great. This feels very like a Zoom issue. Virtual background still loading.
That's okay. Kevin very kindly suggested I could tell some jokes while we were waiting for you to rejoin, but I don't know any jokes, sadly, to tell.
Darn, that would seem like a key Fireside Chat lead competency.
It would, wouldn't it? Right, you can hear me okay now, Paul?
I can, and there's a nice frozen picture of me gesticulating in a meeting now. So
Oh, it's great. I'll just ask you some of the questions from the message board, if that's okay, from the Q&A.
yeah,
So the first one, Matt's asking, there probably aren't any job openings at the Christchurch Call right now, but are there other ways to voluntarily assist and get involved?
yeah, absolutely. There have been some job openings. We've got a really small team. It's dispersed. It's in Auckland, Wellington, Toronto, Boston, Brussels, and in Juneau, Alaska, of all places. So there is a small team that's out there doing the work. If you're not working as a paid employee of the foundation, there are lots of ways to get involved. And I think the first of those would be to hop on our website at christchurchcall.org and pop your name in the segment there around signing up for media and other releases. If people are interested in participating or contributing, we're really happy to hear from them through that same channel, through the info box, or through info@christchurchcall.org. What we are trying to do, as we've got the foundation up and running now, is start to build out the work we had built around a really widespread collaborative community now that we're in a new structure. So we're really happy to hear from people. We have work programs coming up that I'm happy to talk about in a moment around that there will be plenty of opportunities also for folk to get involved in.
Great, thank you. And Ellen has just put that URL to your website in the chat so people can follow it. Thank you for that. Now, Kim also had a question as well as her suggestion about jokes, which was, you mentioned that regulatory efforts can make collaborative work difficult. Are there any regulatory approaches you think would be helpful?
Yeah, I think just trying to work my way through that. There are, and one of the provisions in the call is for governments to look at regulation. That's one of the commitments they undertake as they become a call supporter. I would say there's not a government that's yet got that right. The prima facie evidence for that is that we still have a problem with terrorist and violent extremist content. And part of the challenge here is that governments are working in an area where regulatory efforts have always been tricky. I see one of the people asking questions is Kim Connolly-Stone, someone I've worked with on this topic over the years. And nowhere more so in content. I remember when I stepped out of cyber work to work on content issues, one of my long-standing cyber colleagues from the US looked at me and said, you know, if you thought what you'd been working in to date was difficult, welcome to your new world. And it was right as an observation. I guess if you look at the governments that have sought to regulate in this area, they've all struggled to articulate what to regulate and then how to achieve it. And that is a debate that will, I suspect, occur in New Zealand if the government, for instance, continues to work through its social media ban for people under 16. The leading lights in that really have been the EU, the UK, and Australia thus far. Ireland and Canada are also trying to grapple with some of those
Right.
questions. The best approaches so far have either focused on placing a duty of care or an obligation on tech firms to ensure that their platforms are safe for the people using them. And that sounds great, but it's actually much, much harder to achieve in practice than perhaps if you come from an engineering background or a non-public policy background, the solutions might seem a bit more straight line, but they're actually really challenging to achieve. And I think the first set of reports around DSA compliance, for instance, are a really good observation or good example of that, where you set regulatory baselines, you generally find that's all that you get in a compliance approach, and you'll normally get the lowest common denominator approach to that, while a government and an industry try to work out what the implications of that look like. There's also a significant risk that governments have had to navigate as they've done this, whereby the political process can introduce some really strange quirks to regulatory measures. And they can end up looking like a Christmas tree as events conspire to see added things going on to a set of measures. And regulators then have to try and deal with those as well. And even the most well-intentioned of governments, I think, find themselves struggling with some of the implications of that. So I'd say that regulation is with us and will continue to evolve and develop. That is prima facie a good thing, as long as it is appropriately informed by both multi-stakeholder inputs and an approach that means that collaborative models of doing better than a regulatory model don't find themselves harmed along the way.
I'll get back to the regulation question in a second, but Kay has asked a really good question on the Q&A, which is, what moves would you like to see the New Zealand government take to decrease radicalisation here in Aotearoa?
Yeah. I'm just having I'm seeing the questions pop up now. What could the government do?
Yeah.
I think there's been quite a lot of work on this in New Zealand since the Christchurch attacks. And the Royal Commission of Inquiry really dug into this, in particular looking at prevention and countering of violent extremism programs. There is still work underway, as I understand it, here in New Zealand on that. And the folk in my former area at DPMC are continuing to work on it. I think speaking as CE of the Christchurch Call Foundation, I would go back to the commitments in the call and the need for supported governments like New Zealand, like all of the others that are supporting the call, to work on implementing those commitments. And I think the commitments that are there cover off a safety net for users. They cover off dealing with issues when crises happen. But they really do go to that question of looking at the drivers of radicalisation to violence. They go to the question of governments, industry, and the technical and civil society communities working in a multi-stakeholder fashion to understand the risks around things like algorithmic amplification and to design positive interventions. Those are built into the call. And often, the tech sector will probably have the best understanding of a user journey, designing ways to enable others to have visibility into that, and then to provide those interventions is really important. It's not positive interventions, particularly redirection or helping users who are showing signs of radicalising to violence, generally requires a mix of industry, community and civil society groups and governments to implement them well. And I think perhaps the most important thing here in New Zealand would be to ensure that there's sufficient nuance in that conversation for it to work well. There's often a real false dichotomy, I think, posited between freedom of expression on the one hand, don't touch anything that happens on the internet,
Yeah.
And knee-jerk responses, which often looking for the most straight line operational solution to fix a problem. Neither of those are going to work very well for this problem. And finding ways to break down the edges of that debate and ensure that you end up with good constructive solutions that all of those parties have been involved in developing is going to be critical here.
Because as you've outlined, it's an incredibly complex environment with so many parties involved, and it's changing so rapidly, right?
Yep.
And I guess that leads itself to a question I wanted to ask you, which was about content moderation.
Yeah.
Is the voluntary model achieving the desired outcomes, or do we need to work towards more regulation than currently exists?
Yeah, I'd say it's a little like the last question, actually. There is voluntary content moderation platforms. Let's assume we're working out with a US platform. That platform has the ability under US law to determine a set of terms and conditions for people operating and using its platform. And that legal framework means that the platform has significant latitude around the tone and tenor of the things that are on its platform. So even within the regulatory environment in a very, very laissez-faire model like the US, and I'm speaking here of the sort of a mainstream approach in the US, not the more extreme versions, which would have sought recently to have platforms forced to carry anything. That's a violation. That would be a violation of platforms' own First Amendment rights, or platforms forced to remove content that would violate users' ability to express themselves. Then in that middle ground, there is quite a lot of space for platforms to set terms and conditions to operate accordingly. That is what most people conceive of as a voluntary model, because that goes to the core of the platform's own tone and user base that it wants to attract. And there are some platforms that have achieved some success in that area over the years, particularly special purpose social media platforms that either are there for a professional purpose or other purposes. The moderation is quite different than you'd find on some of the other environments where user-generated content is the key business model. But there is also regulation in place, and there has been for a long time in most jurisdictions. So in New Zealand, we have a regulatory model in place. The Films, Videos, Publications Classification Act, the main aspect of that. There is content that is illegal in almost every jurisdiction, and typically that's child sexual abuse material, quite properly so. But it's also child abuse material because taxonomically that's the easiest material to circumscribe, to describe, to outline, and to regulate for. It gets much harder when you're in terrorist and violent extremist content. There's a portion of the material that is generally illegal in most states, but there's also a large amount of what you'd call grey zone material that's subject to interpretation. So there is regulation in place there. Regulatory models, I think those models will always stay in place, whereby some content is actually circumscribed in almost every jurisdiction. Where regulation is heading at the moment is very much towards things like a duty of care or a code of conduct or something similar. And that means you have both a regulatory enforcement power, but you also have the flexibility to adapt and change as the technology moves to unintended consequences. There are regulatory models that could work very, very well today, but won't in 6 months or 12 months' time, because technology is changing so quickly. So I think what that again says is that the need for a much more vibrant, better informed dialogue between regulators, the tech sector, the full multi-stakeholder grouping is going to be needed to navigate our way through this well. I'm not convinced at the moment that in most jurisdictions the conditions are right for that kind of multi-stakeholder dialogue. I think there are real problems with the way governments relate to the tech sector and real problems with the way tech sector relates to governments. And, some of that's playing out in some quite strange and unusual ways at the moment with philosophies like dark enlightenment and others that posit that we should be ruled by folk who know how to operate the tech sector rather than democracies. There's quite a bit to unpack there, and we could probably have a whole fireside chat on it.
We could. Yeah. We could. You've opened the door nicely to a question that Josh is posing, which is around stakeholders and which countries have had the most interest and influence in the work that the Christchurch Call does. And I'm quite keen to just learn a bit about the multi-stakeholder environment and who the stakeholders are that are most active.
Yeah. So in terms of the countries that we've seen the most active participation from, obviously France and New Zealand over the course of the time that the call's been running as the co-founders, and that both countries have sustained that activity right the way through. I would say we've seen that Canada is probably one of the most active in terms of the work. We work incredibly closely with the government of Canada. We've found some of the work on research into violent extremism and social polarisation that's been done out of the Canada Centre at Public Safety Canada is outstanding. We've also worked really closely with US colleagues in that process until relatively recently, when a number of them are no longer in roles.
Yep.
Across the UK, Germany, Netherlands, there's been a lot of good work done there. The Royal Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan has also been really positively involved in the work of the call since it started. We've had engagement with a number of other countries across the call community, but those would probably be the most active. Spain would be another, actually. The Spanish government has been certainly a strong supporter of call summits, and we've also seen the same when we have had summits with some of our Latin American call supporters as well, Colombia and Chile in particular. That's, of course, a work in progress, sustaining that community. In terms of civil society groups, they have been very much, I guess, globally focused, actually, many of them. There's been a strong North American focus, though. We're actively broadening that out at the moment into Africa and elsewhere to try and make sure we've got a wider range of perspectives.
Nice. And now I really wanted to ask you this question because I wanted a little bit of the behind the curtain kind of stuff. And that is, what are some of the most or more interesting meetings that you've found yourself in over the last 6 years?
Yeah, I saw that question. I've cogitated over it a bit. I guess the first really interesting one for me was while we were still negotiating the call and finding myself in a meeting with the senior leaders of 5 Silicon Valley or West Coast firms, and wandering into that room and wondering quite how I got there, if I could put it that way. And then realizing that they were having as much of a debate around how to deal with this issue as we were. And taking off my tie made a big difference, and being prepared to get a whiteboard pen out and work.
Out of your pocket, I'm sure.
Yeah. I need a pocket protector now that I'm out. And map out the OSI stack with them as we started, and get down to that level of detail as some of them tried to work out what we were trying to do and which parts of their business that affected. And an important moment of revelation there was that the folk in the tech sector, many of them are as concerned about the issues as we are, that they don't have a uniform perspective across the sector. They all have a range of different interests they're trying to manage and protect while they do so, and that can lead to quite a productive conversation if you're prepared to put the effort in. I would say, though, the most extraordinary meetings for me, and I've been on, there've been a lot of them in the last 6 years. The most extraordinary meetings have been with survivors and survivor communities. Those of us working on the call feel an extraordinary weight of expectation when we meet with those people, and quite rightly so. It's pretty grounding, looking at the impacts that radicalisation online and the abuse of the online environment can lead to. Those have probably been the most extraordinary. There's many others I could probably highlight, where I've either had to stand in for our head of government with a bunch of other heads of government, or sit with senior leaders across the different sectors. Those are occasionally I pinch myself moments.
I can imagine.
But actually the moments that are the most, the ones that sit with me are working with folk who've been affected by online violence, or whose loved ones have been, broadcast inadvertently as part of a live stream.
Incredibly poignant, and actually a really wonderful way for us to kind of wrap this up as well, reminding us why you do this mahi and why the Christchurch Call exists. So important. So Paul, you've talked about if people want to volunteer and get involved, and where to go for that. But for the community listening today, who are digital technology folks, how can they all collectively, or what can they do to contribute to helping prevent online harm?
Great question. Report it when they see it, first and foremost, is the most obvious, simple question. I might just tick through 3 or 4 things we've got coming up, because contributing to
That'd be
those
great.
is quite important as well. We have launched a partnership with a US-led and French-led consortium called Roost, Robust Online Open Source Safety Tooling, to work on open source tooling to identify and deal with TVEC. And to keep users secure. A lot of that's around middleware and the importance of things that can help. I think there's something in there around participating in that work as we open it up to the community, because Roost has had a strong focus on child sexual abuse material, actually needs some of those inputs on how to deal with terrorist and violent extremist content. We're leading a project called Catalyst, which has recently commenced work. It's a consortium looking at the problem of misogyny as a driver of radicalisation to violence. Almost every form of terrorist and violent extremist content has a strong misogynist underpinning, or even sometimes an overt misogynist focus. And we're working with 5 other organisations in 3 different global locations, and in the online gaming space, on a set of interventions to see whether we can rapidly iterate some solutions in that area. And there will be work there that we're looking for folk to contribute to as part of a community learning strand in that work.
Nice.
We're looking to update our crisis response protocol and look at what tools we can bring from some of those survivor communities to prevent escalation of violence after crises in future. And again, working on some practical tools there will be something that we'd love a technology focus on, because it's actually critically important to look at what technological interventions can be developed. And finally, the Christchurch Call initiative on algorithmic outcomes. We're working on phases 2 and 3 of that. We have a Delphi study that we've just opened up to bring people together on what an ethics framework and responsible governance of that initiative looks like. There are plenty of opportunities there, I think, to try and help support safe access by researchers to understanding how algorithmic processes affect users. So those are kind of 4 things that I think we will start talking more about, because we've got the scope to do so now, and where members of ITP could contribute. The team and I will always love hearing from folk from Aotearoa, New Zealand's own group of IT professionals. So don't be at all shy about reaching out to us if that's of interest. And we can also be found beyond our website in places like LinkedIn, which is the main social media platform we use.
Right. Well, thank you, Paul. That's a great note to end this on. Sorry we've had technology issues today, folks, but thanks everyone who joined and asked such great questions. And there were 7 more still on the Q&A that we didn't get to. But generally, I think this has been really a good, informative start to understand where the Christchurch Call is today and where it is going. And Paul, I'll definitely follow up with you on how people can get involved moving forward, and we can amplify that message to our membership. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Vic, and thanks to all the members. If there are questions I haven't answered, and I can see a few in there, feel free to drop them directly to us. There were some there that there are very good, short, simple answers to.
Right. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for joining, and I will sign us off. Ka kite.
Ngā mihi, ka kite.